Hey guys, we love having you here every week, and if this is your first time, an extra welcome to you.
Hey, well, great to have you with us today for a series we've simply called Simple. And much of the motivation for this series was I got from sitting in on a conversation that some of our crew were having in one of our Elevate group meetups a couple of weeks ago. And they were just sharing experiences, their experiences around talking with their friends and family, the people in their sphere, about Jesus. And it was pretty universal that when they, in each case, had talked with one of the people in their sphere about Jesus, that things got complicated. The conversation got derailed by misconceptions and wrong kind of understanding of Jesus and of church as well. And so what I wanted to do and what we want to do in this series is just strip things back to the studs and look at who Jesus really is, minus all of the layers of religion and misunderstanding and wrong notions. So hence the name Simple. And one of the best vantage points to get a clearer picture of who Jesus is, as you'd expect, is his eyewitnesses. And so last week, we looked at one aspect of Jesus through the lens of Matthew, who became one of Jesus' closest followers. Today, I want to look at Jesus through the lens a little bit of Paul, and I'm going to come back to that later. But let me start by showing you something that John wrote about Jesus. Now, John was one of Jesus' handpicked followers and one of Jesus' 4 biographers. And later in John's life, he was an older man and kind of looking back on life and writing this kind of memoir, but focused on Jesus and the time Jesus spent on earth. And John had a front row seat to that. And this is something that John wrote. We got the basics from Moses. Then this exuberant giving and receiving, this endless knowing and understanding, all this came through Jesus, the Messiah. No one has ever seen God, not so much as a glimpse. But this one-of-a-kind God expression who exists at the very heart of the Father has made him plain as day. So, John kind of travels way back in time to the law, what we come to know today as the 10 Commandments that God gave the people through Moses. And that was very foundational, and that was very much a guide for right living for thousands of years. And then John points to the time in history where things leveled up significantly. He used the expression, there was an exuberant giving and receiving. There became endless knowing and understanding. And he said this was made possible through Jesus. And then John kind of drops this bomb and equates Jesus with God. Said that Jesus has made God, who people claim they'd never seen, he made God plain as day. John believed that one of the reasons Jesus actually came to earth was to clarify who God is. There was confusion then about who God really is, and of course there's confusion today. who is he? What does he do? Why does he do certain things? Why does he not do certain things? And John makes the point that if you want to know what God is like, look to Jesus. And Jesus came into the world and into not just a time in history, but a place in history where there was an incredibly complicated religious system. And that religious system had drawn a lot of wrong conclusions about God, hence these misconceptions and misunderstandings. For example, this religious system taught and thought that if you were sick, it's because either you or your parents had sinned, and your sickness was a consequence. If you were very rich, it was assumed that you therefore were being blessed by God, and if you were very poor, it was assumed that you were being punished by God. And Jesus dropped into that religious system and said, whoa, time out. That's not what God's like. And in fact, it's time for a new understanding of God and a new pathway of having a relationship with God. And he didn't start by gathering up all of the religious leaders and taking them through a one-day seminar of all the things they got wrong. He started by going around saying to people, giving them a very simple invitation. Follow. Watch me. Listen to me. Consider how I operate. And as you do that, as you follow, it's going to become clearer to you what God is really like. And this invitation, follow, was what I taught on last week. And if I could make it compulsory viewing, either on this channel that you're on, go back and watch last week's message. Or if you want to just take us with you, search for our podcast, Elevate Church Perth, on all of the podcast platforms. And if I could make that compulsory listening, I would. Because it forms the pattern or the approach that Jesus took. So to only listen today means you'll miss how Jesus operated. He operated by first inviting people to follow before they believed. And then he hoped and he had the confidence that over time, as people followed, that would lead them to a belief and then ultimately to want to obey. And I'll talk about obey in our next installment. But this was this idea, and his biographers said this about him as well, that as they followed, many of the people that followed Jesus at a point in time had an aha moment and took a next step, which was to believe, and not just believe in his teachings, not just believe in his morals and his ethics, not just believe in his worldview and philosophy, but actually came to believe that Jesus was who he claimed to be, sent by God as the Son of God, to demonstrate to us what God's really like. And they were so convinced of this that there was a point in the time that they were following Jesus where Jesus taught this particular slice to a broader audience of his followers. And a bunch of them, when he was done teaching, chose to unfollow him. Yeah, it happened. It wasn't all rainbows and unicorns. There was people that had started to follow Jesus while he was physically on this earth and then chose to walk away, chose to drift away. And of course, unfortunately, very sadly, that still happens today. And so when this swathe of people had walked away from Jesus, he turned to his closest followers who were still in the proximity, and he asked them if they wanted to quit. Do you also want to leave? And Peter kind of acted as spokesperson for them and replied, Master, to whom would we go? You have the words of real life, eternal life. We've already committed ourselves, confident that you are the Holy One of God. They had established their belief in who Jesus was. Now, if you've got your Bible or your Bible app, how about you jump into Romans chapter 3. I'm going to read this from the Message version. But this is a letter or part of a letter that Paul wrote to the church in Rome. Now, Paul was one of the early leaders of the church. He was kind of an entrepreneur. He'd launched a bunch of churches in various places around the known world. But Rome was a church that grew up organically. So not only did Paul not launch it, at the time of writing this letter to them, he hadn't even gone there. He hadn't even visited them. And so he kind of felt like a leadership responsibility to write a letter to them to give them some greater understanding, some greater, a much clearer framework around the belief that the Roman church people had come to, in their own journey, follow, believe. The thing to know about Paul was whilst he was one of the leaders of the early church, that wasn't always his story. In fact, his backstory is that he was one of the leaders in the Jewish religion. And he, along with the Jewish religious leaders, they saw these growing number of Jesus followers as being wrong and actually also being a threat. And so Paul's literal job was to arrest Jesus followers at best, and execute at worst. And he was very good at it. And then he met Jesus, and he came to believe, and his life did a 180-degree turn. And so that might be some of you, or people in your sphere, that you or they are miles away from becoming followers of Jesus. But like, this is Paul, and that's his story too. All right, so this is what Paul wrote to the church in Rome. I'm going to pick it up from verse 21. But in our time, in other words, you, the church in Rome, me on this earth, something new has been added. What Moses and the prophets witnessed all those years has happened. The God setting things right that we read about has become Jesus setting things right for us. Now, this was new because the way to get things right with God up to that point had been incumbent on the individual. You know, you had to take it upon yourself to try and do good things, try not to do bad things, keep the law, don't break the law. When you break the law or do bad things, which you will, you have to go to the temple and make some animal sacrifices, and then you'll get back on God's good side, at least temporarily, until you do something bad again. And Paul says everything's changed because of Jesus. That it's no longer about us trying to put more things in the good column than we have in the bad column. It's now that God set things right by sending Jesus into the world to set things right. This wasn't theoretical for Paul. This was Paul's story and Paul's experience. He elsewhere described himself as like the best of the best, the maverick Top Gun dude of keeping all the religious laws. And now he's saying that there's something even better. And that wasn't the only new thing. He then wrote, not only for us, like this new and better isn't just for us, it's actually for everyone who believes in him. For there's no difference between us and them in this. And when he's saying us and them, he's talking about there's no difference between Jewish people and Gentiles. There's no difference between Romans and Greeks. There's no difference between tax collectors and fishermen. That all people, the one thing we have in common is sin. Every one of us thinks, says, and does stuff that's less than God's best. And Jesus gave access to everyone. See, up to that point in time, the Jewish people thought that the God they worshipped was only for Jewish people as his chosen people. And now Paul's saying, no. Jesus has opened this thing up to everyone. This opportunity to get right with God. And because sin is something we all have in common, we all need this. We all sin differently. I mean, that's the reality. We different levels of sin, different consequences of sin. But the point is that when we sin, when we do think and say things less than God's best, it creates separation. You know, it's like missing a plane. If you're late 1 minute or 1 hour, it doesn't matter. You either way, you missed it. And so Jesus came to make things right. And Paul continues, well, since we've compiled this long and sorry record as sinners, both us and them, us Jews and Gentiles, and proved that we are utterly incapable of living the glorious life God wills for us. Okay, well, that's pretty dark. You say, well, you might be tempted to let yourself off the hook. Yeah, I've done some bad stuff, thought some bad things, said some dumb stuff, but not as bad as that person. And Paul's making the point that we're not meant to benchmark ourselves against other people, that the standard is God himself, holy, perfect, without sin. And compared to him, we've all fallen short. We've all missed it. Which this would be a very big wet blanket if it was the end of the story. But there was a comma at the end of that statement that Paul wrote, not a full stop. So Paul continued, God did it for us. Like, phew! Out of sheer generosity, he put us in right standing with himself, a pure gift. He got us out of the mess we're in and restored us to where he always wanted us to be, and he did it by the means of Jesus Christ. Paul clicks on this, a pure gift. And I understand, I get it. We don't trust that line because it sounds too good to be true. And we find ourselves asking, what's the catch? Sign up for our e-newsletter and receive a free gift. What's the catch? Order today and get a free gift. What's the catch? And Paul's saying that what Jesus made possible for us to get into a right standing with God is a pure gift available to everyone, and there's no catch. And it's critical to understand that it is a pure gift, that we don't earn it. It's not about what we do and don't do. It's about what Jesus has done and accepting that gift. In fact, it's like a buyback transaction. We because of our sin, we were taken or took ourselves away from God. And God wanted us back. And so he sent Jesus to pay the price to bring us back. In fact, elsewhere, I think maybe there's a better metaphor used by Jesus' biographers and by Paul, and it's the word ransom. And we understand that word because we watch Hollywood movies. And so, and God, knowing that we were held hostage, held captive by our sin, and we couldn't break out of there ourselves, he didn't send Liam Neeson with his particular set of skills as the ransom. He sent Jesus as the ransom. And because Jesus paid the price, we were set free and restored into a right relationship with God. Paul says it. God sacrificed Jesus on the altar of the world to clear that world, that's us, of sin. And you understand how this kind of transaction works. You already do, because when you see injustice in the world, whether it's the atrocities being committed in Ukraine, this week there was another mass shooting that we sadly had to read about or watch the aftermath on TV about, and the list goes on. And when we see these things, we say, this shouldn't be happening. This needs to stop. Someone needs to get punished for this. And God thought exactly the same way. He saw what we were doing that was bad, that was wrong, that was broken, that was sinful. And he knew that needed to stop, and he knew that someone needed to get punished for that. But instead of hoping someone else would fix it or that we would fix it, God handled it. And yes, somebody got punished. And that somebody was Jesus. He took on the punishment we deserved so that we could be restored into a right relationship with God. And then Paul finishes with this: having faith in Jesus sets us in the clear. Not doing more good than bad, not by our sacrifice. That's earning. All that's earning. All that, again, points the responsibility back on us. Simply having faith in Jesus. Follow, believe. We're invited to follow so that at some point we will have that aha moment that Jesus is who he says he is. Now, next installment I mentioned, I'm going to teach the third aspect of Jesus' approach: obey. And it sounds like a it sounds like a heavy, a bad word, but really it's not, because God's goal is for us to become so convinced of who Jesus is and so grateful for what he's done that we're going to want to do what he asks of us, knowing that he's going to lead us to new and better. We'll see you then.